It'll tell us we're live. There you go. Hi, everyone. Very happy to introduce Alex Gerlis, if I pronounced that right.
Yeah.
Who is going to start us off with a little intro to himself and his book.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to set the scene. We're talking about myself a little bit, and then about my books, and then specifically about my latest book, which is, you can see over my left shoulder, Every Spy as Traitor, which was published today. It's my 12th book. I was born in Grimsby in Lincolnshire quite a long time ago, and went to university in Hull, which in those days was further than it is now, if you see what I mean, because there wasn't a bridge. And then I came down to London, and I spent about 30 years working for the BBC as a journalist. So I worked on a range of current affairs and news programmes, and became eventually an assistant editor in television news. So I was responsible for individual bulletins like the 1 o'clock news, weekend news, 6 o'clock news, breakfast news. So that was quite an exciting time. And then I moved more into a management area and became a managing editor in the television newsroom. And then my last job at the BBC was, for about 5 years, I was in charge of journalism training. And then I left the BBC in 2011. And it gave me the opportunity to concentrate on my writing. But I'd already started writing, because in 1994, it's appropriate that it's today, I was in charge of the BBC breakfast coverage from Normandy on the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And up to that point, I thought I knew a reasonable amount about D-Day. It was this heroic invasion, and the Allies won, and it led to the end of the war. What I hadn't appreciated until I got into it in a lot more detail was how difficult it was. The Allies were meant to, for instance, capture the city of Caen that evening, and it took them well into August before they captured it. So it was a long time before they won the Battle of Normandy. And despite that, they still had this enormous battle, and key to it was the Allied deception operation, because it had conned the Germans into thinking that the invasion was going to be further north in the Pas de Calais rather than in Normandy. So as a consequence, there were two German armies. The strongest one, the 15th Army, was based around the Pas de Calais, and the 7th Army, which was in Normandy, was weaker, and it had fewer panzer divisions with it. And yet, despite that, it was still a big struggle to win the battle. And it seemed to me that had it not been for the deception operation, D-Day may well have ended up as a disaster. So I was sitting, this is the night before we went live. We were doing breakfast news, so we were going on air. I was having to be up at something like 3 a.m, and we were staying in a house about an hour's drive south, so it wasn't worth going back. And I had a hired car, a Peugeot 306, and I'm 6 foot tall, and I was crammed in the back of this Peugeot 306, parked on a cliff top overlooking the beach at Arromanches, and it was windy and I couldn't sleep. And the idea came to me then about a novel based around the deception campaign, and that was my first book, which is called The Best of Our Spies. Those of you who are kind of good at maths will work out that 1994 to 2012, when it was published, which was a year after I left the BBC, is quite a long time. That's pretty heroic going for someone to write a book. But the truth is, our kids were very young at the time, and I was working full-time. My wife was working full-time. And I didn't actually start writing the book until about 2010. And I got an agent. I left the BBC. I got an agent, and the book was eventually published in 2000, at the very end of 2012, beginning of 2013. And it did okay for a little bit. And then about a year after it was published, it was picked up by Amazon. That I don't know how many people here do Amazon and the Kindle Daily Deal, but it was picked up by Amazon and given a chance to be a Kindle Daily Deal. And it did really well. It sold 5,000 in one day. And then something happened in Amazon. They lost another book later that week, and so they put it back in as a daily deal, and it sold another 3,000 or 4,000, and so suddenly the books started to do very well. And my agent had wanted me to move away from Second World War and do contemporary fiction, but I wanted to stick with Second World War. But once Best of Our Spies started to do well, he agreed, and I followed it up, and I've written, well, I've had 11 published before today, all based in Europe, all in the Second World War, all based on real events. So what I do is I look for a real event that actually happened in the Second World War, and then I build the plot and the story and the characters around it. So every single book that I've done has a real event that's at the heart of it. So at the moment, I'm writing my 13th novel, which is the follow-up to this one. And the real event it's based around is Operation Sea Lion, which was the Nazi plan to invade Great Britain in 1940. Very advanced plan, quite a sophisticated one. It's great material for a novelist. So that's what I do. This new one is a slight departure in that the series starts in 1936. So the big event there is Stalin's Great Purge of 1936, and then secondly the rise of the Nazis, and then thirdly the outbreak of the Second World War. So the book finishes in September 1939 as the Second World War begins. So the second one in the series will be set in 1940 against the background of Operation Sea Lion. The third one I think will be based in Italy towards the end of the war, and also Berlin as the war ends. And then by the fourth one will be in the 1950s and deep into the Cold War. That's the plan anyway. And at the heart of the book, when it says every spy a traitor, is a character who is a traitor. So it's a senior British person, upper class, who's very well placed in a important part of Whitehall, who is a traitor. And we don't reveal, the plan is not to reveal his identity until the end of the fourth book. And I can tell you the number of times I thought, you've set yourself a difficult one there. To keep him at the forefront of the story, but not reveal his identity is quite challenging. So that's where I am. 12 books seems extraordinary. I never imagined that that I would do that many. I got the figures in from my publishers last week, and we reckon that with the ebooks, the paperbacks, audiobooks, something like 650,000 copies have been sold altogether, which is really nice. And it's good to have so many readers out there. I really appreciate all the feedback, and it's fantastic to have an opportunity like tonight, Kaz, to be able to engage with readers and answer questions. So thank you for the opportunity.
Cool. We're from the same county. Who knew?
Say that again, sorry.
I said we're from the same county. I was born in Lincolnshire.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
An RAF base. Perfect for this chat.
So which base was it?
My parents were at Binbrook.
Oh, right. I know Binbrook's near Grimsby. Yeah, we used to go past Binbrook a lot, and Scampton still has the Lancaster outside it, doesn't it? I mean, the RAF connection with Grimsby is very strong. And funnily enough, my son-in-law is from kind of West London, where we live now, but his grandfather was in the RAF, and his mother found a menu for Christmas Day at RAF Grimsby, which there was an RAF base in Grimsby. Christmas Day 1942, I think it was, and it was kind of the Christmas Day menu is almost exactly the same as it would be now, except they had cigarettes served to them at the end of the meal. So but the RAF connection is kind of quite strong.
Yeah, there's someone who's just corrected me on the screen and said it was Knoxton Hall. I was born in Knoxton Hall, but my parents are based in Binbrook. And there's someone in our group who was born in the same place, which is
right.
Weird. Like you never normally meet people that are born in the same place as you. I've also spent a lot of time in Hull as well. It's great there. You've got some hellos from Donna. Patricia says she's watching the documentaries about D-Day at the moment. Alison Valentine said good evening
Hi there. Hi, everyone.
as well. Sarah's watching. So there's quite a lot of people sort of.
I can't see any numbers, so all I can see is you, Kaz. So
No, we can't see any numbers or any comments on here, but I've got my phone and I can see the comments there. So
that's good. Well, I'm kind of assuming that there's like a couple of thousand people out there.
yeah, that's like, well, we're just talking to ourselves, but that's
Yeah,
still
yeah.
nice.
Well, that's fine. That's what I mean. That's having a nice chat anyway. So.
What I thought was interesting, and I don't read a lot of spy novels, so I'm going out on a limb here, and this might be more common than I think. But in the few that I've read, they're normally about people kind of fighting for like their country, whereas yours is about people sort of being lured into kind of being traitors for their country in this one.
Yeah, this
Well,
one's
sort of quite a unique sort of approach. This one, like doing that, sort of made you a little bit more interested to begin with because it's quite a different kind of style of.
well. I think too often in books, and particularly about the Second World War, people see things in black and white, and they just there are the goodies and the baddies, if you like. And I think what interests me, even with the Second World War, is that there's a lot of grey areas, and lots of people are kind of not quite as it seems. So, there were Germans that were opposed to the regime, not an awful lot, and not they did an awful lot about it. But having said that, there were, and you get the kind of nuance that I think helps a spy story along. That there are people that are traitors, there are people within the resistance that might betray a group. There are spies that are not very good, that are slightly incompetent, although they might be on the right side and they might be well intentioned. And I think that's what interests me, is that not everyone is perfect. People are quite flawed. So the idea of the spy as someone that's kind of very polished and kind of the action hero. So the James Bond character, if you like, that serves, James Bond character serves a very real purpose. But I think the truth is that spies are quite ordinary. And I have met a few now through the works I do in one or two other approaches. And, so I know a few people that have been in that world, and they're quite ordinary. They're not what you would imagine. They're not people that would necessarily stand out. You could put them in a room with a few dozen other people, and you'd struggle to say this person works for MI6 or that person was MI5 or SAS people I've met, and you wouldn't recognise them as that. And I think that's the truth. It's not that someone would really stand out and look like some movie version of what you might imagine a hero or a villain to be. But it's more complicated than that. And as human beings, we're kind of full of flaws, and people have feelings and they make mistakes. And I think it's important to bring that out in a book.
I 100% agree. Donna I got a really good question for you. She said, "Is it ever difficult being in the headspace of that world, which was so tough to live through?"
That's a really good question, and it is difficult at times, and because it's a very, very dark world, and I base my books very, very strongly on events that really happened. So I visited some pretty awful places. I'm writing about some pretty dreadful things, about atrocities. So the last book but one was published February last year, and that was called Agent in the Shadows, and that is set in Lyon in France around about from 1943 onwards, because I don't know how much people know about Lyon, but it's the third largest city in France, and it was the center of the resistance for a long time. Because it wasn't, it was part of Vichy. The resistance felt they had a slightly easier time in the city, and for a while they did, until Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo officer, was moved in, and he was called the Butcher of Lyon. And it was very, very brutal. And I went to Lyon for a week to do my research there, and went to places like there's the Gestapo prison is still there, where people were tortured, where the most dreadful atrocities took place. I went to the cathedral where the cardinal, Gerlis, was quite a remarkable man. He defied the Nazis. He started the war as someone that was kind of not in favour of the Germans, but he liked the idea of the kind of being order. And the Cardinal of Lyon is like a very, very important position. It's called the Primate of Gaul. So he was a very, very powerful figure. But he once he saw what the Nazis were up to, he sent letters to all of the priests in his area and said, "You mustn't cooperate with them. You've got to do what you can to help people, particularly Jewish people and particularly children." And they did. And there is, for instance, there was a place called Isieux, which is a small town between Lyon and the Swiss border, where about 50 Jewish children were hidden by the priest and the mayor in this small village. Someone betrayed them, and they were all taken to this fort, the prison, the Gestapo prison. They were kept there overnight, and then Barbie, he telegrammed, and so it led to his conviction in the end, because it showed that he knew what was going on. And they were sent to Paris, and from Paris they were sent to Auschwitz, and they were all murdered along with the adults that were helping them. So when you're in somewhere like a Gestapo prison and you're in the cell, which wasn't a very big room, where 50 kids kind of spent the night before being sent to their deaths, I would defy anyone to not feel affected by that. Particularly as in my own case, I have family who were murdered in Europe during the Second World War, so it feels personal as well. We're just seeing it at the moment with D-Day and how raw the memories are for the soldiers that took part in it. Going back 80 years on, they're all finding it very difficult and they're struggling. And these are men who, by any definition, were brave and resourceful and strong, and yet it obviously affected them enormously. So it's a good question, Donna, and I think that it's easy to think, oh, well, it's only fiction that you're writing, it's only a story, but actually it's very real. And I go to big extent to make sure that I'm as accurate as possible, because I'm writing about history. Although I'm writing fiction, I do recognise that. Although I'm writing fiction, I do make a big effort to be as accurate as possible with the history.
Have you written in sort of, I mean, obviously you've got sort of the real historical events. Have you written in real people in history as well?
Yeah.
Into it, because does that make it more difficult as you're writing a story to incorporate those people?
You've got to be careful how you do it, because I think you've got to have a line above which you wouldn't have the real people. So I think if you had Hitler in it with dialogue, or Churchill, for instance, I don't think my agent will let me have Churchill, because he represents Churchill's literary estate anyway. But that stretches it a bit. But otherwise, I mean, for instance, in Agent in the Shadows, with Klaus Barbie, the head of the Gestapo, I did have him in it, dialogue with him. And that's, although it's stretching it, I kind of felt I didn't have him saying anything he wouldn't have said. So it's a difficult one, but I think sometimes, for the sake of accuracy, the alternative would have been that I would have had a character based on who was the head of the Gestapo in Lyon, who would have been, to all intents and purposes, would have been Balby, but he'd have had a name like Schmidt or something. I think that might have stretched credulity a bit. So I do use some real people. I'm doing that at the moment in the book that I'm writing. I've got the names of the 2 or 3 German admirals who were given the task of planning the German invasion of this country. So I'm using their names. I think, kind of, why not? I may as well do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important when you write history, especially history that people do know about, quite recent-ish, but you can't change it too much either, can you? So I think it's probably more accurate and more fitting to keep the real people in.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, there are things where there have been times when I'm quite into making sure that the timeline and the chronology is accurate. And like I was doing it today with a chapter, I just kind of stopped and kind of made a timeline of the 3 or 4 chapters I'm writing, what happened when, just for my own kind of clarity. And if you're using real events, sometimes when you're doing that, you think, well, we could. I'll give you an example. On the book I'm currently writing, on the 16th of July, 1940, Hitler issued what they call the Führer Directive, which was like a very high-level command about the invasion of this country for Operation Sea Lion. So it was called Führer Directive number 16, and that was issued on the 16th of July. It was coincidence, it was the 16th. If I felt, well, actually, that in terms of my book, it would be much better if that was issued on the 1st of July. I could do it, and if people say, well, that's inaccurate, I could say, well, I'm writing fiction, but it wouldn't be right to do it. For me, that would distort the book, and it would distort the authenticity of it and the credibility of it. That's how I feel, I mean, other authors might do it differently, and that's fine. As a writer, you've kind of got the right, if you like, to write it as you want, but I think you've got to be careful. I'm not a fan of what they call, is it counterfactual or imagined history, where you take an event. So, for instance, if I was, say, taking Operation Sea Lion and writing a book and imagined, what about if it had actually taken place and if it had succeeded, and then if this country had been occupied by the Nazis? I don't want to change it to that extent.
Yeah, well, there's the time and the place for both, I think.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like the what if sort of books, like Man in a High Castle.
Yeah.
There's a woman who writes these really great books of like, what if the Roman Empire didn't stop existing? And they're kind of like still there in the modern day, with like modern tech and things like that. And I think stuff like that is interesting, but it's not the same as what you're writing.
Yeah, and it's fine. I think there should be space for everyone. I'm not criticizing people that are doing that. I'm just saying, it's not what I do. I feel that using something like the Second World War and then just before and just after, there's enough what actually happened there. There's enough history there that gives a novelist like myself stuff to write about and keep it interesting and engage the reader. There's enough without kind of having to change it, but that's fine.
So you say you've been to Lyon and places like that. This book has sort of sections in Moscow as well. Have you travelled there for research?
Well, no, I was going to go to Moscow for the book that's just come out, but the Ukraine war started, and it just kind of felt a little bit too risky. It was one thing going there, it's another thing getting out. And the thing is that they would know that I was a BBC journalist, or had been a BBC journalist. And I think I would kind of, at some point I would flag up on some computer. And I think as a BBC journalist kind of wandering around looking at key places, I think it would have been a little bit dodgy. My wife wasn't keen on me going, put it like that. And I could kind of see that it could be very, very difficult. And even though, if I'd ended up in some Russian prison for a couple of months, it might have been quite good for book sales. I think it was, that would have been taking it too far. So, I mean, so that was a shame that I didn't get there. I don't think it's particularly suffered, but it's a shame I didn't get out there. But for the one I'm writing at the moment, I went to Hamburg in February, because Hamburg was a very important centre for the German operation to invade this country. And I was in Rotterdam last week. We were in Brussels, and then I went to Rotterdam for a couple of days on the way back, because that's where they were going to launch much of the invasion from. So I do get out to these places.
And there's a lot of places still to see, isn't there? There's a lot of things preserved. And
in where are you talking generally, or?
Well, generally, like across Europe, there's a lot of places preserved and things that you can still go and see that commemorate. Well,
there is and there isn't. I mean, Rotterdam, for instance, there was on the day of the 14th of May, 1940, the Germans absolutely devastated the centre of Rotterdam. Fairly concentrated area, actually, but they destroyed 30,000 homes. The place, there was a fire that raged for about 3 weeks. 1,000 people were killed. So if you go to Rotterdam now, you come out of very, very attractive modern station into it looks it's looked like it's a place built in the 60s with lots of prefab concrete, a lot of grey concrete. It's kind of really, really miserable. Well, when I then went around other parts of the city, my wife stayed in the centre of it, around the hotel and going to the shops and coffee bars, and she thought the place looked dreadful. But if you get out of that part of the centre around the port, and I found where the German Navy headquarters was and the Gestapo headquarters, that part was quite pretty. So I think in Europe you get quite a lot of contrast in cities between parts that were destroyed and then parts that weren't. And you do notice that. So Berlin is another example of a city that was pretty much destroyed. Warsaw, which I've been to as well, was absolutely destroyed during the Second World War. So you've got to be careful when you look around these cities about what you're seeing that was there then and what it's like now. So the example I often give to people is in London. If you didn't know the city, you would kind of find areas, for instance, areas around Hackney and Bethnal Green, areas like that, which were then very, very poor and that were bombed, and now are very, very trendy. So, you've got to be very careful in that sense about how you write about a place. Hamburg was another example. It was destroyed. There was an enormous Allied air raid in July 43, I think it was, which killed something like 15,000 people. It had been very, very hot. It hadn't rained for weeks, and so the city was as dry as anything, and a lot of wooden buildings. So this air raid destroyed much of the centre of it. So you've got to be careful when you look around now to see what could have been there then and what wasn't.
Yeah. Sarah was saying that we need to visit to see these places.
Yeah.
She's planning a trip for us.
You said you're planning a trip?
No, I said I think she's planning a trip for us. No, I have been to visit things. Like I went to Monte Cassino with my granddad, and we helped people find their friends in the war graves and things when we were on the trip out there, and that was quite sort of interesting to go with people who'd been around, during the war, like been in that area and things. And it would definitely, they could sort of tell you the difference, as you're going, like from what you were seeing when you went as a tourist then to like what it had been like and things. You must do so much research though to get it accurate, because I sense that with you, like you're really passionate about being really accurate, like doing justice to the history. So I can imagine, like you said, the first book took you from like 1994 when you got the idea to 2012.
Yeah.
How long does it take you now, even with the research? So it must still take a really long time to do all the research and get it all right.
Yeah, it does quite a lot. Although during COVID, I signed the contract with Canelo, my publisher, in September 2019, and that was for the first book to be published in March 2020, which it was, and that was it was about a couple of weeks into COVID, the lockdown, and one of the things that happened is that book sales absolutely went through the roof, particularly Kindles. And I think one of the phenomena they found was that espionage fiction did very, very well. Probably a lot of men were dusting off found themselves on furlough, dusted off the Kindle that they normally took on holiday with them, and started downloading the books. So the first book, which was Prince of Spies, that was my fifth book, but the first one exclusively with Canelo, did really well. And I had a 3-book deal, but they turned around and said, could you make this into a 4-book series? So I actually was writing 2 books a year for about 3 years, which was extraordinary. And even now, I don't know how I did it. It was, well, I've got a good idea of how I did it, because we weren't doing anything else. We had lockdown and weren't going out very much. And we've got, grandkids that live around the corner, but we weren't able to see them other than at a distance. So I was writing, and I was doing the research as well as I was going along. So it becomes quite all-consuming. A lot of it is, I think I've got to the stage now where, if you could see around the office that I'm in, I'm surrounded by books and books and books and maps and maps and maps, and they're everywhere. So I've got everything at my fingertips, if you know what I mean. I know where to go. I know where to find the information. So it's a lot easier. And I think the key to it is, I've got a book here, for example. When I was in Rotterdam, I went to the Maritime Museum, and they were very helpful there. And they had a copy of this book, which is written by a Dutchman, and it's about the invasion of England. And it's incredibly detailed, far more detail than I ever need, but it's really, really useful. And the key to it is, I think, that you've got to do the research, but then you've got to wear it quite lightly. If I used some of the stuff that's in there, my God, it would appear tedious. You just have a character saying, well, we're going to put the 5th Armoured Division on. It would just be long lists of troops and everything like that. So you do the research, and then when it comes out, you've got to scale it back a bit so it doesn't look like it's a history textbook. And the other thing, though, that related to that point that I want to make, is that when you do the research, it opens up storylines. So if you stick to the real events that happen, you get storylines that come up. So an example I will give is that for my second novel, The Swiss Spy, I had a character leaving Croydon Airport, which was the main airport in London, in August 1939, and he's flying to Geneva. And those flights existed then. And I didn't know when the airport would have shut down, because I know it became an RAF base. I didn't know when it stopped doing civilian air flights. So I found the Croydon Airport Historical Society on the internet, and I emailed them, and a very nice chap emailed back, and he was very helpful. And he said, he told me when it closed. And then there was a little throwaway line at the end of one of his emails, and he said, by the way, he said, you do realise that civilian air flights continued throughout Europe during the Second World War. I didn't know that. And, I thought I knew by then a reasonable amount about the Second World War, but I had no idea that civilian air flights continued in Europe throughout the Second World War. And what happened was that as long as at least one of the airports was in a neutral country, so the airport, either the airport you're flying to or the one you're flying from, or in some cases both, then they were allowed to fly unimpeded. They had to keep to a ceiling of 10,000 feet and have particular markings on them. But very, very few were shot. The British Airways had a route from Whitchurch Airport in Bristol. I don't know if anyone on this group is from Bristol, but there was an airport called Whitchurch, which no longer exists. It's a housing estate now. And there was a daily route from Whitchurch in Bristol to Portela Airport in Lisbon. And because Lisbon was neutral, that was allowed to carry on. One of the flights was shot down in 1942, I think it was, but that was because the plane came out of the mist, and the German fighter that was patrolling the area didn't kind of see it properly and shot it down. But by and large, these flights carried on. Well, it's an amazing thing to go with, based on that true fact. You can build up quite a lot. I've used these civilian air flights around Europe a lot, and I managed to get hold of timetables, particularly for Lufthansa. And it's a great resource, and it adds something to the story, because you can then say at the end, as I do, when I flag up what really happened and what didn't, I can say, and by the way, civilian air flights, yes, they did continue. That did actually happen.
Myra has commented and said that it's really interesting what you're talking about, especially today. Sarah's saying that her Kindle was an escape.
Sorry, could you say that last bit again?
Sarah's saying that her Kindle was an escape during lockdown.
I think it was for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed, like, I have quite a large to read file, and I enjoyed like knowing that there was like a safety in books there
Yeah.
to read and explore. So we've got the civilian flights and things. We're always interested in. I know you got inspired by sort of doing the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings, but were you always interested in history before that? Is there a reason that's, apart from that, that's drawn you into being a historical?
No, I've always been interested in history. I mean, I was a news journalist, and I think there's probably a connection between the two somewhere. But I've always been interested in it, but never as quite as involved in it as I am now.
I'm kind of interested in your news journalism thing as well, working with the BBC. What can you tell us about that?
Well, what do you want to know? I mean, I worked. I started in current affairs and then moved into daily news. So I was in daily news for the majority of my career, and I was fortunate to get to a position where I was editing daily news programs. So what you would have is a program like the 1 o'clock news would have 2 or 3 assistant editors on it, and they would each take charge of a different day. 6 o'clock news. I used to do a lot of weekends as well. So the day is quite planned. You've got quite a lot of stories around, but it's also very unplanned because by definition, news is something that's happening, the unexpected. And that's what always attracted me most to it was, you'd go in the morning. If you're doing the 1 o'clock news, you'd kind of get there at 6:45 in the morning, and you'd kind of see that there's 5 or 6 reports that have already been organised and they're coming in. But what you really want is something exciting to happen. But also, kind of on the other side of that, is often exciting doesn't necessarily really mean exciting. Exciting can also be tragic, if you know what I mean. So yeah. I think of some of the stories I worked. Dunblane was one. The massacre of the school kids in Scotland, and they were exactly the same age as our youngest. So, and that kind of feels quite personal, and you then suddenly realise, and you sense it in the newsroom as well sometimes when you're dealing with a very tragic story. Is newsrooms can be very, very busy and very bright, vibrant, and lots of hustle and bustle when there's a big story, or shouting, people running around. But sometimes, after the immediate, implosion, if you like, of activity, sometimes people, then become, it quietens down a bit. But I worked on some very big stories like the Iraq War, the death of Princess Diana. Must be a lot more than the death of Jill Dando. I remember because I worked with her very closely, so that was a dreadful shock because for a lot of people it was reporting on someone that they knew very well and who most people regarded as a good friend, a really nice person. So it was a whole range of stories I worked on.
When you were doing the 50th, I feel like we should talk about your coverage of the D-Day thing as well because of the day it is. When you were doing the 50th anniversary, what kind of part of that were you involved with? Were you meeting people who'd been involved?
Yeah. So we did quite a lot with people that have been out there. I mean, we're seeing the people now, aren't we? And they're all, by definition. I mean, there was a guy, one of the youngest that they came across who I saw being interviewed. That was 96. Well, that's I think he was 16 or 17 when he joined up. But 50 years ago, someone like you, there were a lot of people in their 50s and 60s. So there were a lot of people out there. It's also, I don't know if anyone has picked this up from the TV coverage, but there's something slightly strange about D-Day and other big events like that, is that you have these people who are called reenactors that go around, and it's slightly, frankly, weird. There are people that dress up in period costume, usually military, and they go around in jeeps, and some of them, I remember driving along a lane because once you're back from the beaches of Normandy, like behind Arromanches, and between the beaches and the towns like Bayeux, there are lots of little lanes. They're called brocages, which was a big problem for the Allies because they were very difficult for the tanks, because the roads are quite low down with very, very high hedgerow. So it was difficult for the tanks to get off the roads and into the fields, and it was a major problem. But you'd be driving along one, and then you'd have to pull in, and there'll be like 20 mixed bag of 20 people kind of dressed in the uniform of a Northumberland regiment marching along, not quite in step, but almost. And so there's the backdrop of that as well. But what we did was interviewed a lot of people that were there. We had a series of films that had been shot over the week or two before that we showed as well. So it's a big, big production operation. It's very different now than it was then, because the technology then was nothing like as advanced as it is now. I mean, now you can do an awful lot on an iPhone. You know, you can broadcast live on an iPhone. It might not always be brilliant quality, and it might show a little bit. But in 1994, for example, you'd have to book satellite links and the microwave into here and out of there, and then it would always be a bit hit and miss. You didn't know if a connection was going to come up and if it would work and how stable it would be. So it was technically a very, very big operation. And you'd have big outside broadcast trucks that would be brought in to do it all. It was a major operation.
Yeah, we had a journalist come into my school a while ago, and he did it all with an iPhone. An iPhone and like a tripod thing, and then said he sends it to an iPad at work and can edit it himself on there.
Yeah.
And then it's just broadcast live on there.
The BBC
on news, not live, obviously, but
yeah, it's extraordinary what you can do, and the ability to do all that. And when I was running journalism training at the BBC, I think in 2010, this was the early stage when people were thinking about broadcasting on iPhones or editing on them. And so I kind of got the funding to take on a producer for 6 months to develop a training program on it. And he's still there. He's still doing that because it's such a big area. I mean, there are some apps, very specialist apps that broadcasters will use that are quite expensive. But you download the app and then you can kind of edit and you get high quality. It is extraordinary. The way the technology is developed is just kind of beyond recognition, really.
And a lot of technology things, especially communication and stuff, does come from, going back to things you write, does come from like the military.
Yeah. Radar. I mean, absolutely. Yeah.
And we don't realise like how much we're using even in our iPhone or like our broadband that's come from, kind of those sort of sources, or has been developed for that kind of reason.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's like another thing to be thankful for, I guess. So this one, because this book, like I said, it kind of threw me a bit with the people sort of going over to the other side. But it was a really interesting read, and I'm kind of curious as to where it is going to go next. What can you tell us like about book 2?
Well, I think the important thing is that I like to find the right I like to find the right background, if you like, the real story. So reading around it, Operation Sea Lion was really, kind of presented itself to me, and that's been brilliant, and I've really enjoyed writing around it. So you've got to constantly remind yourself about, you've got a couple of traitors here. There's 2 characters. There's the one, you've read the book, so there's Archie, who's the really serious traitor, and then there's Cooper, who is a British agent, but he's also supposed to be working for the Russians, and he's not really quite sure who he's working for. So he's a little bit of an innocent who's kind of been drawn into something that he's not quite sure what's going on. And you've got to keep those characters involved and very much in the story, but bring in other people as well. So I was kind of thinking today about it, that I thought, I've just written 3 or 4 chapters and Cooper hasn't appeared in it, so do I need to bring him back in? So all the time you're thinking about your characters and what you do. And the other thing that I found was, in fact, my agent and my publisher both pointed it out. They felt that in that book there weren't enough women. I don't know what you think, and I could see the point, but then it was
a lot. Where there's a couple of women, I think.
Well, there were. I mean, I'm trying to reflect what life was like a bit in the Second World War, and not many women got to senior positions. In terms of espionage, the Special Operation Executive, the SOE, did have a lot of women in it, a very high proportion of women, but mine aren't in the SOE. So I am aware of that. So when I'm thinking of new characters, I'm thinking, could this be a woman? But there's quite a lot of pressure. Not so much in books, but certainly in TV and film. And my first book has been optioned a couple of times, and at one stage I came close to casting it. And so I'm kind of aware of the pressure that there is there about reflecting diversity in the casting. And sometimes you're being asked to do things that simply weren't the case, in terms of what kind of ethnic diversity can you reflect in it. So all the time you're having to think about how the book looks, that you realize that you're writing a series. So how can you keep that going? So there's the actual, if you like, you're writing 2 books in one. One is the plot that goes throughout all 4, which is this traitor. Who is he? How is he going to be revealed? So keep him in the story and at the forefront. And then you've got the other book, which is just the subject of this one. And how do you tell it and how does it end? And when you're writing a series, it's very difficult to get to the ending in a way that people feel that they've read a book and they want to read the second one or the third one. But what you're trying to avoid is them feeling that everything's been left too much up in the air. So the first one in my second series, which was The Prince of Spies, there was some feedback at the end, which a publisher and I had quite a long chat about, that I think some things were left a little bit too much in the air. So you've got to resolve things a bit, but you've then got to kind of carry it on. And it's very, very difficult to do that. I mean, I often think I would just like to write one-offs, kind of go back to doing that, because that's easy. You've got a beginning, middle, and end, and you're not having to think all the time about how can I kind of keep this up. So I'm very aware now. I have as on my computer here. I will always have the text of the first book open, and I'll have a notes for the third book. So as I'm writing book 2, I'm constantly going back to book 1 to check on what happened then. And then I'm constantly making notes to make sure that I'm not doing something. The point you want to avoid is you want to avoid having a situation whereby you're halfway through book 3 and you think, oh God, I killed this person in book 1. It's really screwed me for the plot now. And you've got to be thinking ahead all the time for that.
Makes sense. I was going to ask you if you'd had any options, because I feel like you would make good TV.
So The Best of Our Spies has been optioned twice, and then nothing came of it. It got quite advanced at one stage. There was a script, there was a treatment for 7 episodes, and at one stage, it was around about this time, actually, it was probably about 3 years ago, I was getting all these emails from the production company with video clips of French actresses say, what do you think? And it was all kind of slightly bizarre, and they had a male lead who was a British actor, quite well known, who'd agreed to take the male lead. And so it was beginning to make quite a lot of progress. But as everything in film and TV, it's money that talks. It's an expensive thing to make, particularly something like Second World War, which is like a period drama. And in the end, they're looking for either streaming services that will buy it and pump loads of money into it, or they're looking for broadcasters that will buy into it as well. And that just didn't do very well. So we are with that. There's another company has now come in and is interested in it. So haven't got an option yet, but they've got the script and they're looking at it. So it's kind of, fingers crossed there. But I'm enough of a football fan to know that even if you're winning 1-0 or 2-0, frankly, with 5 minutes to go, it's still a long way to go. And I think that I try and manage not to get overexcited. I think if it actually happens, it will happen. There's a clause in all contracts for TV and film, which is that the money comes and everything, and it's called the first day of principal photography. So actually, that's the first day when they start properly filming it. And I think, wherever you are, you're an awful long way from that. And until that happens, I won't get too excited. But it'd be great to think something like that will happen. I think the first one would make a really good TV series. And the script, I didn't want to do the script. And they brought in quite a well-known script writer, and he did what I thought was a really good script and a really good treatment. And I actually wrote a treatment for a season 2, which they wanted as well. So there's it's kind of there if someone wants it. So if there's anyone out there who fancies it,
anyone watching? I warned you about this before we went live because I've been told off for not warning people. Favorite questions to ask is, what have you read recently and enjoyed?
Okay. Well, I did actually. I mean, I said to you when you told me, and I did say I read an awful lot of history books, and so this is one of them, which is here. It's called Invasion 1940, and it's by Peter Fleming, who actually was the brother of Ian Fleming, who wrote James Bond. And he was an intelligence officer himself in the war. So that's a very good book. It's very good background for me. But we were on holiday about a month ago, and I did manage to read 3 books for review. I get quite a lot of books sent to me for review, particularly to do the short 2 or 3 sentence reviews that are used a lot online or on book covers. So I read one. I read a Mick Herron book, Slow Horses, which everyone had been telling me I've got to read, so I thought, well, I'll read it. And it was very good. Then one by Merle Nygate called Honour Among Spies. That was very, very good as well. And then there's a book which is published in this country in October by I.S. Berry, the Sparrow and the, I can't remember the exact title actually. I could have got them out there. Shall I go and grab them? Would that be helpful to show them?
Yeah, if you want to.
Okay, I'll be back in 10 seconds.
Are we going to count down from 10?
Okay, so here we are. So this is the Mick Herron book, Slow Horses, which is good. Merle Nygate's book, which is Honour Among Spies, which is very good as well. And then this one is going to be very big. This is a proof, as you probably see, so that's not the real cover. But I.S. Berry she's relatively young actually. She's in her 30s, and she was a former CIA officer. So this is set in the Gulf, about spies and things going wrong and revolution. And it's been a very, very big hit in the States. Really good book. And so I read that as well because I had to do a blurb for that. So that's what I've been reading. But it's slightly unusual for me to read fiction. I just for 2 reasons. One is I find that the reading time that I have, I really need to devote to doing research. So it's a shame because I love espionage fiction and crime as well. I like. Yeah. And the other thing is I've got a slight nervousness about reading fiction because can you guess what I'm getting at?
Go on.
I'm nervous about kind of characters, not so much about plot, but characters and ideas, because I often find when I'm reading, I'm thinking about the characters and what I would do with them and something like that. And I sometimes worry that I might subconsciously pick up a character or something that character does, and then they might appear in one of my books a year or two down the line. It's not really happened, but it's something that I'm kind of quite aware of and have to be constantly thinking about.
I've heard of authors who do that, but they'd swap genre while they're writing crime so that they're reading something else.
Yeah.
I don't feel that would happen.
But the thing with me is I'm not really interested in a lot of other genres. I mean, I still think there's enough in common between crime and espionage that they're two very similar genres. I would say. So I feel that I'm just not a big. There's not many other genres that really grab my attention. So it's a shame, but I occasionally do that. I've got another book that I'm reading at the moment that I was sent to write the blurb for, and that's kind of quite good. But I'm reading that Second World War espionage as well.
I've got a recommendation for you, but you may have already read it.
Yeah.
Which is this Codename Madeleine.
Oh right. When did
Jameson. It is out. It's about special operations. The SOE. And I'm sure you can guess who it's about from the code name. But it's I don't know what to say about it. I don't know if I like it, but it's like it lived with me for a long time after I read it.
Well, that's good, isn't it? It's to say you're not sure how you feel about it, but if you do want, I think you like to think this book stays with the reader.
Yeah, it's a very powerful book. I'd heartily recommend it if you're interested in that kind of book. But it is not easy reading.
Do you mean the subject matter?
Yeah, the subject matter is like you were saying, that you can't avoid the subject matter, and the subject matter can be quite dark.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
write it realistically like you do, you can't shy away from that.
The thing is, it's interesting that you raise that, Kaz, because my previous editor, Michael, who was one of the bosses at Canello, and then he left a few months ago, and he was my editor, and he would often flag up when there was a lot of violence, particularly involving children, and he just felt that it had kind of like he had a threshold, and sometimes it gone beyond it, and so he would flag up and say, "Do you think you've gone a bit too far here?" And I could see where he's coming from, but I think that you've got to be very, very careful. And this is, I don't know if you've come across the fact that quite a lot of publishers now employ sensitivity readers. Are you aware of that?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, I don't have sensitivity readers, and I frankly wouldn't allow one of my books to go through a sensitivity reader, because it's ridiculous. Because you end up, and I've had this with people flagging up things in my books, when you got Nazis doing and saying unpleasant things, and it seems to me that if you leave that out, if you tone that down, then that's denying history. If you don't describe what is going on in Gestapo prisons and in concentration camps and what their propaganda was saying, if you kind of tone that down to the extent that you don't want to offend or upset people, then it's not going to be true to the history. So I think you have to be sometimes quite brutal and kind of quite blatant. I mean, there's a group I belong to on Facebook called Spybury. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, which is a very good group of about 5,000 espionage readers and writers, for you as well. And there was a discussion there about the use of violence and how, when people write about violence, how well it comes across. And that was quite interesting, because some people were saying, it often doesn't come across a bit kind of ham-fisted, so to speak. But I think you have to find a way of describing it, not particularly in a gratuitous way. But if the Gestapo, we know, did some of the most dreadful, unimaginable things, and you can't not describe it. You can't not talk about it. And some people do find these books dealing with the Second World War too difficult to read. And that's fine. If someone is uncomfortable with that, no one's forcing anyone to read it. I understand that, but I think you've at the same time, you've got to respect that if someone is writing about the Second World War, that they're not going to hold back in terms of how they describe it.
Exactly. And on that note, we're coming to an end. Remind people what they're going to go away and buy.
Okay, well, let me grab a copy of it. So this is Every Spy a Traitor. So it's out today. So this is the hardback. It's on Kindle as well. And if my first book, which is The Best of Our Spies, there's a BookBub promotion, so it's 99p on Kindle today. The first one. This one's on Kindle. It's also an audio book as well. Very good guy called Philippe Bolscher did the narration for it, and he's been tweeting about it today. And you've got there. Whoops, if I can get it right. Yeah, that's my Twitter or X name. So if you want to follow me, please do that. Are you on Twitter? Does your book club have a Twitter thing?
We have a Twitter. It's not. It's my dad, and he doesn't always. It sporadically twitters does our own thing. We're also on it as the author chat sort of team are on it as well. So I'm on it as my own.
Well, follow me on Twitter, and then you'll be able to kind of keep up the news. But it'd be great if you can buy it. And it's been really, really nice. Some good questions.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you. You're welcome back.
Well, thank you.
We're a big fan of Canelo in this group. I don't think they put out a bad book.
Well, Canelo do, as you know, a lot of crime, don't they?
They do. And it's always excellent.
Yeah, they have a very big crime list.
Yeah.
So have you had Nick Louth on?
We have, yes.
And so that's another Lincolnshire connection.
Yeah.
Because he lives, but there's some very good crime writers, and the various Scottish women. So that's it's a good company actually, because it's an independent company that was started by 3 guys about 10 years ago, and it's established itself very well now. I mean, it's got some quite big lists, and they're beginning to do more on espionage. So there's a book called Spy Alone, which was written by Charles Beaumont, who's got the same editor as me, former MI6 officer. It's not his real name. It's good company.
Fabulous. And thank you so much for joining us.
That's a pleasure.
Pleasure.
All the best.